right. Well, I'm going to introduce our next speaker. So our next speaker is a colleague of mine, and we're going to be talking about understanding the labor-intensive forest workforce here. We have Emily Jane Davis, or we call her EJ. She's Associate Professor in the Department of Forest Ecosystems and Society and the the Director of the Extension Fire Program at Oregon State University. I first met EJ in Central Oregon when on the Ochoco Collaborative, and enjoyed working with her. And then she came to OSU, and that was a really good thing. And we are so happy to have you here today. And I will pass this off to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Fitz. I'm glad to be here with all of you today, and I'm having some internet issues, so I'm going to turn myself off video for this presentation. Moderators, Fitz, if at any point my audio is giving issues, please jump in and interrupt me, okay? Does that sound good?
Sounds good, EJ.
Yep.
All right. I'm going to share my screen and turn off my video. Great. So again, I'm really appreciative of the opportunity to come and speak to this audience about a topic that is really, really close to my heart and I hope of interest to all of you, which is the labor-intensive workforce in Oregon. And I think that over the many decades of Oregon's history, we've really focused a lot, or we tend to think immediately of, right, Paul Bunyan, big men cutting down trees, or more recently, we tend to think of work in the woods as involving, right, highly specialized technical machines like these that are able to cut down trees and work on steep slopes. And you know, the reality is that a lot of the work in the woods is actually labor intensive, very labor intensive. It's not performed by machines. It's not performed by Paul Bunyan. It's done by hand. And this is often a diverse workforce, often involving a large number of Latino or X people. And these trees aren't huge. They're like the ones in this picture, small or brushy. And the slopes can be pretty steep and dangerous to be out on foot on all day with a chainsaw. And this is super important work, as we know that it restores forest health and it helps protect our communities from fire. But those that are performing it have often been invisible and marginalized rather than celebrated. So that's what I'd like to kind of bring some more light to today. I just want to acknowledge that some of the material I'm drawing on today, working on this with a lot of partners. This is a project funded by USDA Agriculture and Food Research. And I've listed all my co-authors there, as well as folks who have helped with data collection, who've been involved in this, in understanding this labor-intensive workforce for a very long time. I want to acknowledge them. What we'll explore today in the time I have is what's the nature of these businesses that perform the labor-intensive work? Who is this workforce? What are the challenges faced in that workforce? And what, if anything, can help create more equitable conditions and overcome some of the challenges? And I do want to have I want you to have a few things in mind as you're listening to my talk today. One is that most of what's known about this workforce is actually through qualitative interview-based research over several decades by dedicated researchers and practitioners who came before me and were studying these issues long before me and long before there was more contemporary interest in this work. So I'm honored to be picking up their tradition. Second, I'm going to share some quantitative data that I just want you to understand is provisional. These are initial analyses. We continue to learn new things about these data. They don't just exist out there in a neat category for us to pull. And in particular, it's hard to filter out this forestry services labor-intensive work from fire response contracting in order to get that picture separate. And then, so I'll mention more about that. And then most importantly, I do want to note that this is not my lived experience. I'm speaking to you today about forest workers, and I'm receiving professional recognition for it, but it is not my lived experience. It's a story I can only tell through research, and voices like mine shouldn't always be centered over those of workers. So I'll start with, the way we know some things about this labor-intensive workforce in Oregon is because we have federal service contracting data. So as many of us know, these businesses are working on not just federal, they're also working on private, tribal, and other lands. But because the Forest Service and other agencies procure services from the private sector, there's data available about those businesses. And so the objectives, right, that the Forest Service and other agencies are entering into here is they're trying to have the private sector provide these forestry activities to accomplish those ecological and community goals. So thinning, burning, reforestation, all of these things. And there are a number of businesses that specialize in this work, as we all know, and some do also engage in fire responses and additional revenue stream to expand out their business model. So one big take home, again, I think many of you know this already, but Oregon is actually a very big player in this forestry services industry nationwide. So looking at data that we've compiled from 2001 to 2020, Oregon businesses procured 30% of all the solicitations procured nationwide. So this is, again, Forest Service contracting data. This isn't the full picture of what these businesses do, but it's a good way to understand kind of what these businesses are doing. That 30.3% was over almost 21,000 solicitations in that time period. And then Oregon, businesses made up 16.3% of all the businesses that were in this service contracting sector nationwide. And that was 1,363 businesses in Oregon. So that's also pretty impressive. And then in this time period, the sum of all the contracts procured by Oregon businesses amounted to $1.43 billion. That is 36.2% of all the value of contracts procured nationwide, which was like $3.94 billion. So I just threw a lot of numbers at you, but again, the take home is like, we are a big player. Oregon brings a lot to this. This map shows the location of businesses who obtain these contracts around the state, again, in that time period of the last 2 decades. You can see that the most contracts were obtained from certain places, Josephine, Jackson, Deschutes, and Marion counties. The 2 things to look at in this map are, one is the number inside each dot. That number shows the number of these businesses that were procuring contracts in that county. And then the color and size of the dot indicates the numerical range of contracts obtained there. So we have some hot spots around the state, and we'll talk a little bit more in a minute about why some of those hot spots are where they are. I also just wanted to show this circle thought. This shows where these Oregon-based businesses were actually performing or place of performance for this labor-intensive work. The big take home here is that they actually perform a lot of it in the state, way more than any other state. In fact, although you will find these businesses traveling around the West and other locations, a lot of the activity from this work, the economic activity from this work, is realized here in Oregon. And over time, these businesses have increasingly relied on a Latino workforce. This workforce has a range of statuses, from being native-born U.S. to being second-generation naturalized U.S. citizens, legal permanent residents, temporary workers on H-2B guest visas, and undocumented workers. One clear trend that's pretty recent in just the past decade is that the number of workers in the H-2B or guest worker program doing forestry work in Oregon has really increased. So the graph on the left shows the number of forestry businesses that were certified to have H-2B workers in Oregon. And then the one on the right tracks with it pretty well. It's the number of workers certified to come do this work. Again, I emphasize there are a range of statuses in this industry. This work is not being performed entirely by H-2B workers. However, there are clear increases in the number of H-2B workers that are coming. The last thing I'll mention about these businesses is also not news to any of us. They face worker shortages, these smaller forest-based businesses. There was a study of all Oregon businesses recently that found almost 63% of our small businesses are struggling to find workers, and that we're actually second in the country, only behind Missouri, in how much this challenges small businesses. And my years of interviewing these kinds of businesses and these owners suggest that this was true in this industry a long time before our current situation, and that it's not new to this sector. I'm going to shift now to talking about these workers. I've been talking about the businesses a bit. Let's talk about the workers. I'm also going to shift from using graphs and the quantitative data to bear on this question, and instead focus on what's known from qualitative data. So actually pretty much all research on this labor-intensive workforce has been qualitative, and that's often out of practical necessity. Qualitative research, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is really well suited because you can't really access this population through mail or an internet survey. Workers can be challenging to locate because they're out working. They're often far from communities, or they may not want to participate in research or feel safe due to fear of consequences. So if you're going in doing conversational interviews on a schedule that works for folks, that's a good technique. You can have more detailed and contextual responses, and you can also have more adjustment for cultural sensitivity than with some kind of questionnaire. So I'll talk about a few things that the research has shown us over the years. So first is how workers come into this industry. Prior research has found that non-Latino workers in this industry commonly find this, job openings that they hear about through their social networks, their friends and families. Then they apply directly to the contractor. But for Latino individuals instead, they tended to enter this industry through what you would call like a more deliberate recruitment tactic, embedded in their social and often familial context. So in other words, recruiters are often friends or family. They play a big mediating role in connecting employers and employees for recruitment, but also on an ongoing basis. So beyond job acquisition, this can involve expectations of respect and concern about retaliation and getting a negative reputation with your friends, your family, and your network. There are documented and often extensive occupational safety and health issues in this industry. So felling trees, working with chainsaws, working on those steep slopes, all the other aspects of this work pose risks. Being struck by a branch, chainsaws, rough terrain, heat stroke, musculoskeletal disorder. As we know, driving is also really dangerous. And for these workers, it's often in crowded transport vans on forest back roads. Other challenges come from inconsistency in the training and skill building that workers receive to work safely, and equipment that might not be consistently maintained or up to date. As a result of these situations, workers in this industry have higher job-related injury and illness rates compared to the average Oregon worker, as well as higher fatality rates. Another challenge is wages. This is a paper from 2007. At that time, forestry services jobs, these labor-intensive jobs, paid far less than logging. Both logging and forestry services were below the federal poverty line, but these forestry jobs much more so. In 2003, there was an hourly wage of less than $12.50 an hour for 60% of those workers. And more recently, there's not an updated research study, but just a quick look at Bureau of Labor Statistics shows that for forest and conservation workers in Oregon, there's a mean wage of $19 an hour and an annual mean wage of about $40,000. This was data from May 2021. So there are still these occupational differences if you look at the other types of forest-related workers on here. Back to that. Another aspect of wages to remember with this workforce is underemployment or forms of wage theft. So even though federal law requires that workers be paid time and a half for hours over 40, and state law requires they be paid for things like the time they spend transporting tools from their van to the work site, it can be possible to misreport those hours and underpay workers for the number of hours worked despite these laws being in place, particularly if enforcement is lacking. There's also been research that compares job quality in fire suppression jobs versus these labor-intensive forestry services jobs. This study found that Latino versus non-Latino workers often had poorer conditions generally. So disrespectful treatment, injuries that were not compensated, the risks of negative reputation and not being able to get a job if they complained, and not really professional advancement opportunities. But the study also found that the job quality for those Latino workers could be somewhat better in firefighting. Costs for things like travel and training were more often covered by the employers. And the researchers note that this might be because fire suppression contracting obviously has different structures, forms of management, and just tighter control of conditions due for it needing to be standardized in different ways. The last challenge that I'll note that faces this workforce is that these workers are really not consistently in decision-making spaces about forest policy and management. There's obviously a pragmatic dimension to this. Again, they are working in the woods, or there are language barriers, or there's safety barriers to that. But these are workers who have often hands-on experiential ecological knowledge from working on the ground, many of them for many years. They're directly carrying out the prescriptions the agency managers develop, and increasingly also that we know get developed or weighed in on through collaborative and community groups. But these groups just have not often been venues for forest worker voices. And this is improving, but traditionally forest workers have not really been included in framings of the local community or family wage jobs. And then again, as I note though, there's limitations on the resource time and safety that make this challenging. So I've probably overwhelmed you with and now I'm going to overwhelm you more with, this is complex. This arena, it doesn't fit squarely in one box. There are a number of different factors that drive the arrangement and conditions that we see in this labor-intensive workforce, all the way from different kinds of labor laws, forest and fire management policies, forest and fire management needs, immigration, what's going on in home countries for those who are coming to work from other countries, social ties. So it's this very socially and politically complex environment. So what do we do about that? How do we address that? How can you improve safety and equity in this workforce? So one approach you might say is, well, you can empower and educate the individuals that are within this environment. This picture shows a community health worker or a promotora out interacting with forest workers. So the Promotora program is where community health workers are trained, members of this community are trained, and they go out and offer workers information about their rights and resources in their own settings. Like in this case, they're actually out in the field on the job site. Oftentimes they go seek them out at their home, their lodging, or at a place where they know they'll find them in the community. This is a proven approach that's been evaluated from qualitative research because it helps deliver very pragmatic, specific information that workers may not have been given by their employers. And it's also delivered by people within the same cultural network and context. Another way to potentially, again, at that level of empowering and educating individuals is to offer skills-based education. So again, areas where employers may not be providing particular types of skills that would allow workers to understand the work they're doing better or have more specific safety practices. There's opportunities to increase their skills and knowledge. Another important area is private landowner awareness. So many of these businesses are working on private forest land in addition to the federal and other lands, as I noted at the beginning. But many landowners, small private landowners, may not be aware of the working conditions they might be purchasing when they contract out the work on their property. So some of my co-authors on this work and I are actually in the process of publishing an extension guide that helps landowners just increase their awareness of this industry, be more aware of potential inequities, and it includes a number of questions that they can actually ask of potential contractors. We hope to be publishing that guide out in the extension catalog quite soon. It's already gone through peer review. But you know, everything I just described is relying on individuals to make changes, and largely that's, you know, giving more tools to the workers is good, but it's still putting something on them to change. And if you think back to my diagram from a minute ago with all of those factors, you really need to also change the system, even though that feels like staring down a super complex tangled maze or ball of yarn. So what would that look like? Some of the, you know, each of those factors that I listed in that diagram would require a number of things to be worked on. But one opportunity is, you know, you can increase use of alternative federal contracting approaches like stewardship contracting that could incorporate criteria other than best value to the government, because consistently incentivizing the lowest bids is where businesses end up having to cut corners in order to keep their work viable. There are, you know, different benefits and challenges with alternative contracting approaches for businesses and for the agencies and for communities. So those have to be considered. Something we've heard a lot over the years is the need for labor law enforcement. So I was rereading early policy issue papers from 2006, 2007, and talking to a colleague who's worked in the field a long time, and they said most of these things are still true. It doesn't matter that that was 13 years ago. We still need more labor law enforcement. There's just not a lot of eyes on this space. Also, more explicit inclusion of workers in decision-making about forest and fire management. As I noted a minute ago, that can be very difficult for pragmatic reasons, but how can we start bringing their voices into these dialogues and better considering how some of the prescriptions that we're all talking about that we think make sense from an ecological standpoint, what is that going to mean from, not just an economic feasibility standpoint, which is really important too, but for the workers that are going to be involved. Those of us at universities and in professional groups, we have a role to play too. We can focus more research, education, and outreach on these populations. So a research project, actually a multidisciplinary project that my colleagues and I have underway, we're trying to do more research to understand all of those factors in my diagram, the community, social, and policy factors that drive or inhibit equity in this industry. We need more education, right? So that promotora programming really effective, but it's been very limited in its execution. Can we also provide training for supervisors who are managing the work on a daily basis out in the field, and owners to help increase awareness while also respecting they're running businesses, they're very busy. Can we also do more extension so that all of us who are land managers, who are extension practitioners, who are economic development practitioners, can we just get a clearer idea of what this is, how these factors come together? So those are some of the things that we can work on. We certainly have to remember a few things in doing that. It's really hard to access the forest worker participants in our research and education programming because they have seasonal work and migration patterns. That's often affected by or shaped by wildfire and when people can be out in the woods. The pandemic has made things harder in terms of being able to safely access populations. And then there's just this need that, this recognition of awareness of our role and how we can have respectful relationships, but especially when it's not our lived experience, like I spoke about at the beginning of the talk. I just want to close with, going back to an image of a forest worker in the woods, because I want to remind us about what this is all about. And there are some implications of this talk. So we all are acutely aware that the forest management and wildfire risk issues that are driving the demand for this workforce are growing. They've been growing a lot over the last few years for both state and federal agencies. The Forest Service, the BLM have doubled, really increased their targets that they're trying to hit. The Forest Service has a new wildfire crisis strategy. The federal agencies have infrastructure and other sources of funding coming. And Oregon has invested $195 million through Senate Bill 762, a good portion of which is for landscape resiliency projects or small private forest land projects. So there's a lot of work to be done on the ground, and there's a lot of money coming for that work. So as we continue to see that level of increased investment and work that needs to get done, and some of it on rather quick timelines, I think we need to think about first, what's the effect on the businesses that are being relied upon to supply this work? Are they receiving the time and resources they need to do this work safely and effectively? Some of the businesses that have really core skills that not all, and capacities like burn box and things that not all other businesses have, putting a lot of pressure on them. It's just putting a lot of pressure on workers too. And again, there's a struggle to find workers. My concern is really that with all this increased investment, we can't have this work be on a foundation of unsustainable and inequitable labor, or it's not going to really achieve the goals we want it to have. I think all of us arguably want to see our homes and communities protected and see equitable outcomes as a result of that. So I think it's on all of us at all levels to respect this workforce, from the decision makers in DC and Salem to our local collaborative groups, by raising the equity and safety considerations that I talked about and making space for workers' voices, even as a small start wherever we can. So thank you, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, EJ. Let's see, I don't see any questions in the chat, but I have one for you. In all of this, and are there some contracting companies that really have their act together? I mean, really robust training, very inclusive type of workforce within the company. that's doing all this work? I mean, like that might serve as a model how you go about.
Yeah. That's a great question. I haven't explicitly studied that, and I'd hesitate to name specific companies. Amanda may want to speak to that. I would note that this is a space that Lomakatsi Restoration Project has been in, where they have done their training and their crews and focused a lot on this. Amanda might want to answer that.
Okay, Amanda.
Yeah, I can answer that. One company specifically comes to my mind that really hires a lot of the Latinx community, which is Miller Timber. They do a lot of different services, and they also work. I did a field trip with them just a few weeks ago with somebody from the Oregon Department of Forestry, who's the individual that's creating the 20-year strategic plan, thinking about all of this fuels mitigation work and the need. And Miller basically said that they're working in Washington and California and Arizona and Colorado and expanding their workforce. But they'd love to do that here. The work is here. They'd love to just do it here. But they have a really good model, I think, especially for those folks that are in the Latinx community.
Great. Thank you for that. Yes, and I've seen Miller Timber's workforce because they work on the research forest out here on the McDonald Dunn and other places. So let's see. We got a question in chat. Let's see. Any other questions for EJ? No? Okay. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. That was a lot of information, and there's a lot of pieces to that. Thank you.